Hello and welcome back to the Veg Garden. So in today's video I'll be talking about wormeries and their benefits and uses to a gardener. So a wormery is essentially a compost bin, a small compost bin that has special types of worms in it that can break down a lot of material relatively quickly. So I use red tiger worms. These are capable of eating up to half their body weight a day in material. So if you've got 3 kilos of worms, you can put 1.5 kilos of material in every day and it'll just be decomposed. So I tend to work out how many worms I've got roughly in a container in a worm farm, and then chuck that much food in that'll last them a week. Most of mine have at most 0.5 kilo to 1 kilo of worms in them. The bath has, I'd say, about 5 kilos of worms. So I put about a wheelbarrow load of manure in there every week and they just eat through it. If there's some woody or fibrous materials, you should leave that longer because they won't break that down as fast. But food scraps, they will break that down quite fast. There's no smell to a worm farm as far as external smells are concerned, so once you put the lid on, there's not going to be much smells around the bin, unlike a compost bin or like a hotbed that can smell quite far away from the bin even. You don't get none of that. It's also quite good for a small footprint garden or areas that are underutilised. You can stick a worm farm there with a few pots on top and it looks nice and you're producing a lot of organic matter. You can make reasonably good potting compost with vermicompost or worm farm compost, worm castings, by mixing it with sharp sand. Now I have done this to some extent with these pots here. You can see this is a mix of soil, sand and worm castings, and it is quite a good mix actually for plants to get going, but you don't want to mix too much worm castings in because it's quite volatile stuff. It's really nutritionally dense, so it will give the plants, it can burn the plants if you give it too much, or if it's too fresh and you're going to need to leave it age a bit, maybe a few months, but it's still faster than a conventional compost bin. You don't get vermin issues as such with worm bins, this because they're sealed. Most of the time they have a sealed lid. My bath doesn't have a sealed lid, but I've got material over the top and the material never has holes in it, so I know there's no rats going in there or anything. So you're not attracting anything nasty to the garden that you don't want to. Also, if they're sealed, you shouldn't really get flies in them or maggots, but you can, and I'll come on to that later. So the next step, next chapter in this video is choosing a worm farm, choosing a worm bin that best suits your context. So I don't know, you might have seen the YouTube short that I did last week, or you might have seen the Instagram reel I put up of a pipe being buried in the ground. Now this is actually a test worm farm. So I've drilled holes in the side of a pipe and I've buried it and I filled it with worms and scraps. And then the hopes is that the worm scraps will be eaten down and be fed into the soil, and the plants will root into it and take out what they want. So it should just feed the soil around it for about 0.5 square metre. I will also be mulching around this, but not as heavily as the other beds, because that is hopefully going to be the main source of fertility for that garden bed, is the worm castings in the centre. This feeds the soil direct as well, so you're not having to carry worm castings to beds, and there's no lugging it back and forward. You just take your worm scraps, chuck them in a hole or in the pipe and leave it to it. if you put a pot on the top, it stops all the smells and the flies going in. So I've actually found a little plant pot that seals perfectly in the top, and I put a little flower plant in the top of that. They're low maintenance, very low maintenance actually. I've put that one in now nearly a month, and I've only actually chucked things in it on the first day. I should really check on it, but yeah, it's doing fine. Also, the only problem you can get with a pipe wormery is if we have a heavy frost, all the worms are going to die in there. So you are going to have to put more worms in. There's not really a way of keeping them frost proof unless you mulched over the top of them in really bad weather. But the eggs of the worms will survive freezing, so even if the worms themselves die, the eggs will come back. So you've got to have a really hard frost to kill off a worm farm. Mine, I just throw a few rags over them and that's enough. My favourite is actually a bath wormery, because it's big enough to put large quantities of food scraps or manure in. So if I'm making something in the kitchen, and I could come out of the kitchen with like a bucket full of scraps, like after peeling, after slicing runner beans or podding peas, I could have a bucket full of shells, so I can just chuck them in the bath, and I know the worms will take care of that. Ideal for horse manure. I wouldn't put goat manure in there because it's too rich. Goat manure is quite a rich, well, it's not quite, it's very rich actually, high in nitrogen and nitrates, so you don't really want to put that in there. Same as poultry manure. I would avoid putting poultry manure in a worm farm, purely because it's so high in ammonia. You'll actually kill the worms, you'll gas the worms out. So you want to leave it age first. If you are going to put it in a worm farm, you need to leave it age at least 6 months. For a bath, you use horizontal migration. That's how you empty the bath. So you feed the worms on the left for a few weeks, and then you can empty the right and put more food in the right. You can, to start off with, just fill the whole bath up to a certain level, put your worms in, let them eat it all down, and then you want to feed them on the left 1 week, right the next, and then you're sort of working back and forwards to eat all the material, and then when they're on the left, say, you can empty the right, or vice versa. And then we come on to the stacking bins. Now I've made one, I bought one. These are quite good because they've got a tap in the bottom to get the worm juice out of. And with these you use vertical migration, so each tray you fill and then the worms will move up. So when the bottom tray is empty of worms, you can use that as fertilizer in the garden. So you tip that tray out and then you put the empty tray back on top and fill that, so the worms are always moving upwards. The worm tea can be stored in a reservoir in the bottom, and like with the bath, you're going to have a bucket under it constantly. You can buy your own, but I will be showing you how to build one in a future video. They're not that hard to build really. You've just got to make sure that you've got containers that are the same size, that will, like these propagating trays here, that will sink down into one another. Because if you've got like wooden boxes and you make them that they can't sink down, when the level of the compost is eaten down, the worms can't get into the tray above. So when this tray, say, is full of compost, and as the worms start eating it down, it'll lower itself, and the bottom of the box will always have contact with the top of the compost, which is ideal. If you are going to make a wooden one, you need to make it that the sides are angled. So now we're going to go on to troubleshooting problems. So if you've got waterlogging or it's real oversaturated, it will go anaerobic. So you want to add lots of carbon-rich materials such as wood shavings or newspaper or cardboard. You ideally want the bin to be the same consistency as a sponge that you've just freshly squeezed, like a wrung out sponge. So 1 to 2 drops of water should come out if you squeeze a handful of worm castings. You can get maggots or flies in some worm bins, they can squeeze their way in. How I deal with it is generally I don't worry about them, but if you are going to use it for potting trays, what I'd suggest is you tip out your tray onto a tarp or some sort of sheet that will hold all the material together, and the worms are photosensitive, so they'll dive down, they don't like the light, and then you can just by hand scrape off the top layer of worm castings, and then more worms will dive down, and you just keep going until eventually you'll have a ball of worms, and you put that back in your worm farm, and then you're left with all the worm castings that are empty of worms. Then what I do is I'd lay these out over a tarp flat with all the maggots in them, because the maggots won't really dive down as much. And I'd leave this out in the sun for a day, and either the maggots will dry out, or you'll have a lot of wild birds come and pick the maggots out, pick any little insects out that aren't so good. You could also chuck this in with the chickens for a day and let the chickens scratch over the tarp. I don't have chickens, so I'll just use the wild birds as my insect larvae removers. If possible, you should restart the bin if that happens, like by tipping it out and letting things remove the maggots. If not, if you've only got a small amount, you could pick them out by hand and then chuck them out for the birds to eat or whatever. So now I'm going to talk about things to avoid feeding a worm bin, and what things you should feed a worm bin. So I personally don't feed orange peels or any other citric related products, because the citric acid can kill the worms. Maybe the odd rind here and there is okay, but in general I'd avoid it. Onions and other alliums, they can also have the same sort of effect. The pungent smell of garlic, onions, leeks, they can actually kill the worms as well. If you are going to put the papery skins of onions in there, that's fine, as long as you leave them out for a day or two to air, and then all the smelly chemicals will blow off in the wind, as long as the husks don't blow off as well. You can kill the worms with them quite easily. Another one to avoid is glossy paper, because they won't actually eat the plastic, and then you'll be left with microplastics all in the worm bin. It makes a right mess. Also really rotten stuff, so blue bread or stuff like that. I generally try and avoid putting blue bread in there, because the microbe balance will get chucked out, and when the microbes get chucked out, the worms will try and escape, and they'll go up the sides and out the top, and you'll have a pile of worms all over the floor and none in the worm bin. So it's not ideal when your worms have escaped, and they will try and escape. The first day or two when you make a worm bin, they will try and escape, so you're going to have to put native soil in there and already pre-made compost and loads of different things to try and get the microbe balance perfect the second you put them in. So what I tend to do is make a worm bin, leave the microbes do their thing for a week, then put the worms in. I don't tend to have problems, but I have had, the first bin I ever made, I did have worms coming up the sides, and I opened it one day and there was worms all up on the tops of the lid and everything. They're everywhere. So you could put the bin in a bag for a few days, like a recycling bag or something like that, just so that if any come out the sides, they do drop in, because like I said before, when your bins are full, there's actually a gap to the sides here that worms can escape. But if they're happy, if they're being fed, they should be happy. If the microbalance is fine, they won't go out the sides. There's nothing for them to leave for. Especially once they feel air and see the sun on their face, they tend to go back down, so they don't like that. What else can I waffle about? Things to put in there to feed them. Any veg scraps apart from onions, like we talked about. Potatoes are a funny one. They'll eat the potatoes, but if you leave a potato eye, the eye will keep growing. So I chuck them in and then just pick out all the little shoots and put them in the normal compost bin once they've eaten all the peelings from around the eyes. They probably do eat some of the eyes, but if the eye starts chitting beforehand, you can also plant the shoots, but they won't come very well because they got no food source, just being a sprout. Tea bags, as long as you have biodegradable ones, or if you pull the tea bag apart and chuck the insides out, they really like tea and coffee grounds in small quantities. Again, if you put too much caffeine in there, you will kill them. They'll have an overdose on caffeine. So a little bit now and again, just to get them working harder, is good, and they do like the really fine sort of consistency of it. Cardboard and paper, they go nuts for cardboard and paper. I feed them loads of paper, loads of cardboard, and I don't tend to have problems with it. They just chew through it like mad. You can even see where they've been, there's little lines in it the first few days, and then it's gone. Rotting fruit, anything that's gone soft. Fruit and veg, generally, I put it in no matter how rotten it is, because, you know, it's not bad bacteria, it's just rotting. You can also put stale bread and biscuits. Mine, well, the ones I've got, I've tend to found that if you get any stale biscuits and you just crunch them up in your hand and put them on the top, they really like them, because I suppose they're like a little snack, and they, you know, high in fibre, and they're quite easy to digest for them because they haven't actually got mouths as such. They sort of have like a gritty, they got to have some sort of grit, like a chicken, to sort of grind away at the food. So you want to make sure this all bits are in small particles. Even going as far as food blending some things would be a good idea. It does take a lot more work, I know, and electric, so what I tend to do is chuck everything in a bucket and just chop them up with the shears. That tends to work fine most of the time. I don't seem to have any problems with it. Yeah, I suppose that's about it. You can even have little wormeries, I've seen, that go under your kitchen units, under your kitchen sink, that you could scrape your food scraps straight into that, which is quite a cool little idea. So I think that's it for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next week.